Consistent commitment. We are to consistently love God and one another, regardless of our circumstances. Here's Gene.
When you look at Judah, for example, at the time that Jeremiah was writing, there's one basic word that you can use: inconsistency. They were not consistently loving God and one another. Regardless of the circumstances, they chose to follow evil. Now we have an example of that, an illustration of it, in Jeremiah chapter 34, and I've called this the people and their slaves. This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord after King Zedekiah made a covenant. Now let me just underscore that, again, Zedekiah was the last king of Judah that was taken into captivity. So this happened during the reign of Zedekiah. He made a covenant with all the people who were in Jerusalem to proclaim freedom to them so each man would free his male and female Hebrew slaves. Now, Zedekiah knew enough about the law of God that every 7 years they were to free their slaves, the men who have and women who have sold themselves into slavery. And so he decided that they should all free their slaves. They were all to be obedient to that law. So we read on here, and no one would enslave his Judean brother. All the officials and people who entered into covenant to free their male and female slaves in order not to enslave them any longer obeyed and freed them. Zedekiah, this very pagan king, said, free your slaves, according to the law that we read in Deuteronomy. But notice what happened. Afterward, however, they changed their minds and took back their male and female slaves they had freed and forced them to become slaves again. Now, why did that happen? Well, if you read on here in chapter 37, verse 5, you have an answer to that question. Pharaoh's army had left Egypt, and when the Chaldeans, that is the Babylonians, who were besieging Jerusalem, heard the report, they withdrew from Jerusalem. What happened? Zedekiah said, we're under pressure. We need to placate God. We need to free all of our slaves. We need to get mercy here. And then all of a sudden, Pharaoh attacks the Babylonians, and they leave the besieging of Jerusalem to fight the Egyptians. And so what does Zedekiah do? He leads all the people to change their minds and take their slaves back into slavery. That's what you call inconsistency, based on trying to manipulate God. And so we see this illustrated in the life of Zedekiah and the people of Israel at that time. As I was thinking about that, I thought, just thinking practically how easy it is when things are not going our way is to promise God we'll do something. But when we experience His grace and everything seems to be going our way, we revert to the old patterns. That tendency has been around for a long time. And Zedekiah illustrates it to the nth degree in terms of inconsistency. We have a beautiful model of consistency in the New Testament with the Apostle Paul, and he referred to himself as well as Silas and Timothy when they were in Thessalonica. And notice what he said here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. I call this a model of consistency. You are witnesses, he wrote to these Thessalonians who become believers. You are witnesses, and so is God. I love that statement. Boy, you've certainly got to be sure of what you're saying if you say God is a witness. And Paul goes on to say what they witnessed. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how devoutly, righteously, and blamelessly we conducted ourselves with you believers. Now, they weren't perfect men, but they lived consistent lives. And I'm sure when they made mistakes, they asked forgiveness. In fact, I know they did. But I love this next illustration of how they demonstrated this consistency. As you know, like a father with his own children, we encouraged, comforted, and implored each one of you to walk worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. Beautiful illustration of the challenge that we have as earthly fathers who are believers to live consistent lives. And all of us, of course, can identify with the fact that we haven't lived consistent lives, and I know over the years I've had to go to my children and say, forgive me. I could keep you here for a while sharing illustrations of that. But that's part of being consistent, is when we fail, is to ask forgiveness. And then to move forward with God's grace, not to repeat that kind of mistake, that kind of inconsistency. The foundation to this consistency is stated by Jesus when he was asked, what are the greatest commandments? This Pharisee who came. And so Jesus said to him, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Now, let me simply say that someday, when the new covenant is fulfilled in Israel, they will love the Lord their God with all their heart, with all their soul, and with all their mind because of God's work within them. But we're in process of practicing that. This is the greatest and most important command, God first. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus went on to say that all of the law can be summarized with those two commandments. And that's why Paul, of course, said, now abides faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. Now, a question for application is simply this. In what specific ways do Christians today violate the greatest commands? That is, the commands to love God with all our hearts and souls and minds and our neighbors ourselves. Well, we could all share how easy it is to violate those commands. For example, there are Christians who simply conclude, God must be very pleased with my business practices because, look, even though I'm cheating a little bit, look how much money I'm making. Well, I got news for you. Some of the richest people in the world are pagan. They're not obeying God. That's a rationalization to actually justify cheating, dishonesty, simply because we're making a lot of money. That's violating the greatest command, to love God with all our hearts, our soul, our mind, and our neighbor as ourselves. Because anytime you have cheating involved, you're going to involve cheating against somebody. Or the person who says, you don't understand. Out there in that business world, gutter language is the language of the day. Now, I'm not going to use that language around my children. I'm not going to use that language around you, other believers. But when I'm out there, I'm going to be like them because that's the language they understand. They justify foul language. I know Christians have done that. That certainly isn't loving God with all our heart, our soul, our mind, our neighbor as ourselves. Or, as I've heard people say, God really must be pleased with this relationship that I have with this other individual sexually, even though I am not married, because it feels so good and I've got to follow my heart. How many times, by the way, have you heard people in the culture today say you got to follow your heart? Regardless of sexual behavior. Whether it's heterosexual or homosexual, you got to follow your heart. The very fact that we feel good about something doesn't mean it's the will of God. So rationalization can take place. So here's the principle that I think is very important for all of us that comes out of this Old Testament passage and, of course, the whole of Scripture. We're to consistently love God and one another regardless of our circumstances. That should be our goal, to become more and more like Jesus Christ.